The first splash of water hit Calvin Peterson's windshield at precisely 2:17 p.m. on a sweltering August afternoon. He jolted upright in the driver's seat of his gleaming black Lexus SUV, startled from his conference call. Through the tinted glass, he watched in disbelief as a wiry old man in faded overalls stood knee-deep in the creek, methodically filling a metal bucket and hurling its contents toward the vehicle. "What the hell?" Calvin muttered, fumbling to unmute his phone. "I'll have to call you back," he barked at the executives waiting on the other end. He hadn't spent $63,000 on this vehicle to have some crazy hillbilly using it for target practice. The old man, 75 if he was a day, didn't even pause as Calvin emerged from the car. Instead, he simply dipped the bucket once more into the clear, rushing water and lobbed another arc of creek water across the hood, mud and small pebbles clattering against the pristine finish. "Sir, what do you think you're doing?" Calvin shouted, his Italian leather shoes sinking into the soft earth as he approached the creek bank. The old man straightened up slowly, like a tree gradually returning to position after a strong wind. His eyes, remarkably clear and blue beneath his sun-weathered brow, fixed on Calvin without a hint of apology. "Giving your fancy car a bath," he replied, his voice as rough as the gravel underfoot, but with an unmistakable hint of mischief. "Seems like the least I could do, considering you parked it on my land without asking." Calvin glanced back at his SUV, now dripping with creek water that caught the afternoon sunlight like 1,000 tiny prisms. He had pulled off the main road about an hour ago, finding the shaded spot alongside the bubbling creek to take his calls in peace after the unreliable self-service at his rented cabin had dropped 3 important calls in a row. "This is private property?" Calvin asked, suddenly less certain of his righteous indignation. There weren't any signs. The old man set down his bucket and waded toward the bank, moving with the careful precision of someone who knew every stone and contour of the creek bed. Up close, his face was a roadmap of wrinkles, each one carved by decades of sun and weather, and Calvin suspected a lifetime of dealing with trespassers like himself. "Been Miller land since 1889, the old man said. "I'm Harold Miller. My grandfather's grandfather homesteaded these acres when this was nothing but wilderness. Never much needed signs before folks in city cars started thinking any pretty spot was put here for their convenience." Calvin felt heat rising to his face that had nothing to do with the August sun. "Look, I apologize for the misunderstanding. I'll move my car immediately." Harold Miller shook his head slowly, water dripping from his rolled-up sleeves. "Too late for that now. You're already here, and I've already started the ritual." "The ritual?" Calvin asked, unable to keep the discomfort from his voice. A slow smile spread across Harold's face, revealing surprisingly strong teeth for a man his age. "Creek time," he said simply, as if those 2 words explained everything. "Once it starts, it has to finish. Family tradition." Behind them, the Lexus's alarm suddenly blared to life, lights flashing across the peaceful woodland scene. Harold didn't even flinch at the sound, but Calvin spun around in alarm to see a lanky teenage boy standing beside the vehicle, another bucket of creek water suspended mid-throw above the car's roof. "That there's my grandson, Jesse," Harold called over the alarm's wailing. "He was just saying we don't get enough city folk around here anymore. Looks like today's our lucky day." Calvin stood frozen between the creek and his car, suddenly very aware that he was 3 miles from the main road. His cell phone was in the cup holder of his now locked vehicle, and the only witnesses to whatever creek time entailed were the birds, the trees, and 2 generations of apparently territorial Millers. Calvin Peterson had negotiated multi-million-dollar deals across 3 continents, but nothing in his corporate playbook had prepared him for Harold and Jesse Miller. The teenager silenced the car alarm with another splash of creek water, somehow the perfect amount to short the electronic system without damaging it. While the elder Miller stood watching with arms crossed, a late afternoon sun casting his tall shadow across the mossy bank. "Listen," Calvin attempted again, forcing a diplomatic smile that had served him well in boardrooms. "I understand I've trespassed, and I apologize. Perhaps we could discuss reasonable compensation for my mistake." He reached for his back pocket, where his wallet contained enough cash to solve most rural inconveniences. Harold's weathered face crinkled with genuine amusement. "You think this is about money?" Jesse, now standing beside his grandfather, mirrored the old man's posture with uncanny precision. Despite the nearly 60-year age gap between them, Calvin could see the familial resemblance in their lean builds and in the set of their jaws, stubborn determination passed down through generations. "City folks," Jesse said, shaking his head with the world-weary disappointment of a 16-year-old who believed he'd seen it all. "Always thinking everything's got a price tag." Harold nodded sagely. "Creek don't take cash, son. Creek takes time." A flutter of genuine alarm passed through Calvin's chest. He glanced at his watch. A Swiss timepiece that had cost more than some people's monthly salaries. The executive board meeting was in 2 hours, and he had promised to video conference in with the quarterly projections that were saved on his laptop. In the city, time was literally money. Out here, 3 miles from the nearest paved road, he was beginning to suspect different rules applied. What exactly does creek time involve? He asked, trying to keep his voice level. In answer, Harold gestured toward a small wooden shed nestled among the trees that Calvin hadn't noticed before. First, you've been eating different clothes. Can't do creek time in a. He paused, scrutinizing Calvin's attire with obvious disdain, whatever that fancy outfit is. It's an Armani suit, Calvin said reflexively. Jesse snorted. Creeks don't care about Armani, mister. Before Calvin could formulate a response, a screen door slammed in the distance. Looking up the gentle slope beyond the creek, he noticed for the first time a modest farmhouse partially hidden by ancient oak trees. A woman with silver-streaked dark hair was making her way down a well-worn path, carrying what appeared to be a basket. That's Grandma, Jesse said, a hint of warning in his voice. She's bringing lunch. Lunch? Calvin echoed weakly. Can't do creek time on an empty stomach, Harold explained as if this clarified everything. The woman, presumably Mrs. Miller, approached with a brisk efficiency that belied her years. Up close, her face showed the same outdoor-weathered quality as her husband's, but her eyes were sharp and assessing as they took in Calvin's presence. So this is our visitor, she said, setting down the basket. The one who thought our creek view was put here for his convenience. Calvin felt himself wither slightly under her gaze. Mrs. Miller, I want to apologize for the misunderstanding. She waved away his words. Harold explained about creek time. Not exactly. Mrs. Miller nodded as if this was the answer she expected. Creek time isn't something you explain. It's something you experience. She began unpacking the basket, revealing homemade sandwiches, a thermos, and slices of what looked like freshly baked pie. But first, we eat. Calvin glanced desperately at his watch again. Ma'am, I have an important meeting. Meetings come and go, she interrupted, handing him a sandwich wrapped in wax paper. Creek's been here longer than any company you work for. Something in her tone, not unkind but immovable as the ancient oak trees surrounding them, made Calvin reluctantly accept the offering. The sandwich was thick with layers of ham, cheese, and vegetables he suspected had been grown in a garden rather than purchased at a store. As the Millers settled comfortably on large rocks beside the creek, Calvin remained standing, sandwich in hand, increasingly aware of the absurdity of his situation. Here he was, a senior vice president of operations, effectively being held hostage by a septuagenarian, his wife, and their teenage grandson, all because he'd chosen the wrong spot to take a conference call. You might as well sit, Harold advised, patting a flat rock beside him. Creek time doesn't start until after eating. That's the rule. Whose rule? Calvin asked, reluctantly lowering himself onto the rock. Harold looked genuinely perplexed by the question. The creek's rule, of course. These should fit well enough, Mrs. Miller said, handing Calvin a stack of well-worn clothes from the shed. Harold's cousin Leroy left them here last summer. He's about your build, though a bit broader in the shoulders. Calvin accepted the faded blue jeans, flannel shirt, and rubber boots with the same reluctance a condemned man might show toward a blindfold. His Italian leather shoes were already ruined from creek mud, but surrendering his Armani suit felt like the final capitulation to whatever rural justice system the Millers had devised. You can change in there, Harold pointed to the shed. Don't worry about the spiders. They mostly keep to themselves. Mostly, Jesse added with a smirk. Inside the musty shed, Calvin stood amid fishing tackle, ancient garden tools, and what appeared to be hand-carved wooden decoys. Sunlight filtered through cracks between the weathered boards, casting stripes across the dirt floor. A daddy longlegs made its deliberate way across a shelf of mason jars filled with unidentifiable objects suspended in cloudy liquid. As he struggled into the stiff jeans, at least a size too large and held up only by an ancient leather belt with a tarnished buckle, Calvin's phone buzzed in his discarded suit pants. The calendar reminder for his board meeting flashed on the screen. With fumbling fingers, he typed out a message to his assistant. Unavoidable delay. Reschedule board meeting. Rural emergency. He hesitated before pressing send, struck by how inadequately those words captured his situation. How could he explain that he, a Harvard MBA and architect of the company's Asian market expansion, was being forced to participate in something called creek time by 3 generations of a family who spoke about their waterway as if it were a sentient being? When Calvin emerged from the shed, the Millers were waiting. Harold nodded approvingly at his transformation, while Jesse unsuccessfully tried to suppress a laugh. What? Calvin asked defensively, tugging at the baggy flannel shirt. Nothing, Jesse said. Just thinking how much you look like one of those actors in city movies pretending to be country folk. Mrs. Miller shot her grandson a reproving look. Don't mind him. You look fine for creek time. Better than showing up in funeral clothes. She gestured toward his carefully folded suit now resting on a clean flour sack. I'll keep these safe. Calvin felt oddly vulnerable in the borrowed clothes, as if he'd been stripped not just of his designer suit, but of the authority it represented. The rubber boots squeaked with each step as Harold led him back to the creek bank. First lesson of creek time, the old man announced, stepping without hesitation into the clear running water. You don't just observe the creek. You join in. Calvin stared at Harold, then at the water flowing around the old man's knees. You want me to stand in the creek? For starters, Harold confirmed, creek time begins with getting acquainted. Jesse was already splashing into the water a few yards upstream, reaching down to lift a smooth stone from the creek bed. Grandpa, he called, I found another arrowhead. Harold's face lit up. Bring it here, boy. Let's have a look. Calvin remained on the bank, watching his grandfather and grandson examine their find, heads bent together over the small object. Despite his predicament, something about their shared enthusiasm stirred an unexpected feeling in him, a vague nostalgia for connections he'd never actually experienced with his own grandfather, a stern banking executive who measured affection in trust fund deposits rather than shared discoveries. Mr. Peterson, Mrs. Miller's voice broke through his thoughts. She had positioned herself on a flat rock near the creek's edge, a basket of what looked like mending in her lap. The creek's waiting. Meeting her steady gaze, Calvin realized he had no choice, at least no choice that wouldn't make him feel foolish in the face of her calm expectation. With a resigned sigh, he stepped into the creek. The cold water instantly flooded his borrowed boots, making him gasp. Jesus. Creek's fed by a spring about a mile up, Harold explained, seemingly impervious to the temperature. Stays cold even in August. You could have warned me, Calvin muttered, fighting the urge to retreat to the bank. Harold shrugged. Some things you got to experience firsthand. That's what creek time is all about. As the initial shock subsided, Calvin became aware of the smooth stones beneath his feet, the gentle but persistent pressure of the water against his legs, and the surprising clarity of the Miller farmhouse kitchen smelled of fried chicken, biscuits, and something sweet baking in the oven. Despite its modest size, the room felt spacious and welcoming, with well-worn wooden floors that creaked pleasantly underfoot and windows thrown open to catch the evening breeze. Calvin sat awkwardly at the kitchen table, his borrowed clothes now almost dry, watching as 3 generations of Millers moved around each other in a choreographed routine of dinner preparation. Hope you're hungry, Mrs. Miller, who had introduced herself as Mamie, said as she slid a cast-iron skillet of golden cornbread onto a trivet. Creek time builds an appetite. Calvin's stomach growled in response. Despite his predicament, he couldn't deny that the aromas filling the kitchen had awakened a hunger he hadn't felt in years. His meals in the city were usually rushed affairs at his desk or carefully portioned creations at trendy restaurants where the presentation outshone the substance. Can I help with anything? He offered, feeling strangely self-conscious about his idleness. Mamie regarded him with surprise, then nodded toward a stack of plates on the counter. You can set the table. 4 places. As Calvin arranged the mismatched china plates, each one faded and chipped in ways that spoke of decades of family meals, Jesse burst through the screen door, a mason jar clutched in his hands. Caught fireflies for the porch later, he announced proudly. Small points of light blinked inside the jar, illuminating the boy's face with an ethereal glow. Harold looked up from where he was slicing tomatoes freshly plucked from the garden. Good thinking, boy. Can't have proper creek time without fireflies. Calvin placed the final fork on the table, wondering what role fireflies could possibly play in this increasingly elaborate ritual he'd stumbled into. Before he could ask, his phone buzzed in his pocket, the 3rd time in the past hour. Stepping into the adjacent sitting room for privacy, he glanced at the screen to see 15 missed calls and a flurry of increasingly concerned text messages from his assistant, his CEO, and most worryingly, his largest client in Singapore. With a growing sense of panic, Calvin began typing a response only to be interrupted by Harold appearing silently at his elbow. Creek time rule number 2, the old man said firmly. No machines. Calvin clutched his phone protectively. This isn't just a machine. It's my livelihood. People are depending on me too. They survived before you answered their calls, Harold pointed out. They'll survive until tomorrow. He held out a weathered hand. Phone stays in the basket by the door until creek time's complete. For a moment, Calvin considered refusal. He could demand his car keys, threaten legal action for what was essentially unlawful detention. But something in Harold's steady gaze, not threatening, but immovable as the mountains visible through the window, made him hesitate. One message, he negotiated. Just to let them know I'm alive and will be in contact tomorrow. Harold considered this, then nodded. Fair enough. Make it quick. With trembling fingers, Calvin composed a brief message to his assistant. Unexpected situation. All fine. Completely off-grid until tomorrow afternoon. Handle Singapore call. We'll explain later. He pressed send, watched the message deliver, then reluctantly placed his phone in the woven basket by the door, already containing what appeared to be the family's devices. There, Harold said with satisfaction. Now you can be properly at dinner. The meal itself was unlike anything Calvin had experienced. The food, simple but abundant, seemed to Calvin's city-trained palate almost supernaturally flavorful. The tomatoes burst with sunshine, the chicken was perfectly crisp outside and tender within, and the cornbread had a sweetness that made him close his eyes involuntarily with each bite. But more remarkable than the food was the conversation. The Millers really talked, during meals. No phones, no television humming in the background, no rushed bites between checking emails. They discussed Jess's school project on local ecology, a neighbor's new calf, the best spots for blackberries this season. They laughed often and easily, disagreed occasionally but respectfully, and somehow managed to include Calvin in their family rhythm without making him feel like the outsider he clearly was. So Mr. Peterson, Mamie said as she passed him a second helping of blackberry cobbler he hadn't requested but couldn't refuse. What do you do when you're not parking on other people's creeks? The question caught him off guard. How did one explain global supply chain optimization? Calvin woke before his phone alarm would have sounded, roused by unfamiliar birdsong and golden light streaming through curtains that smelled of sunshine and lavender. For a disorienting moment, he couldn't remember where he was. The room, small but comfortable with handmade quilts and simple wooden furniture, bore no resemblance to his minimalist condo or the boutique hotels he frequented on business trips. Then he remembered the creek of Miller's creek time. He sat up, noticing his borrowed clothes had been laundered and folded neatly on a chair by the window. His expensive suit hung on a wooden hanger on the back of the door, looking strangely out of place among the room's well-worn simplicity, like an artifact from another life. The house was quiet as he dressed in the clean but faded clothes, but he could smell coffee brewing somewhere below. Following the aroma downstairs, he found Harold in the kitchen, 2 steaming mugs already on the table. Right on time, the old man said by way of greeting, "Creek's waiting." They drank their coffee in companionable silence, the rich brew stronger than Calvin's usual carefully calibrated pour-overs. Harold offered neither cream nor sugar, and Calvin found he didn't miss them. Through the kitchen window, he could see the first rays of sunlight illuminating the mist that hovered over the creek, transforming the ordinary landscape into something that looked like it belonged in a museum painting. "Beautiful," he said softly. Harold nodded. "Best time of day, before the world gets too busy with itself." They walked together down the well-worn path to the creek, Hugh soaking the cuffs of Calvin's borrowed jeans. The world seemed muffled and expectant in the early morning light, as if holding its breath for something significant. "Where are Mamie and Jessie?" Calvin asked, realizing he hadn't seen them. "Last part of creek time is just between you and the water," Harold explained. "They said their goodbyes already." A pang of unexpected disappointment struck Calvin. He'd grown fond of the spirited teenager and his no-nonsense grandmother in the short time he'd known them. "I didn't get to thank them," he said. "They know," Harold assured him. At the creek bank, the water ran clear and melodic, much as it had the day before. Yet somehow it looked different to Calvin now, less like an obstacle or backdrop and more like a living entity with its own purpose and rhythm. "So," he asked, watching sunlight dance on the ripples, "what happens now? What's the final stage of creek time?" Harold seated himself on a large flat rock at the water's edge, gesturing for Calvin to join him. "Remember what I told you last night? Creek gives something. You give something back." Calvin nodded, reaching into his pocket to feel the smooth stone he carried since yesterday. "The stone? Do I return it to the creek?" "If that's what you think it wants," Harold said enigmatically. "Creek time is different for everyone. Some people leave something physical. Others leave something you can't see." Calvin considered this as he watched the water flow past, disappearing around a bend in the distance. What had the creek given him? What could he possibly give in return that would matter to ancient water that had shaped stones and landscapes for centuries? "I don't understand what it wants from me," he admitted finally. Harold smiled. "That's because you're still thinking like a businessman, making transactions. Creek doesn't want something from you. It's about what you need to leave behind." He gestured toward the water. "Why don't you ask it?" Feeling self-conscious but strangely earnest, Calvin turned his attention to the flowing water. "What should I leave behind?" he asked softly, not expecting an answer. To his surprise, the question itself seemed to clarify something within him. The creek hadn't just given him a stone or fossil sightings or even the peaceful evening on the porch. It had given him time. Time outside his carefully scheduled existence. Time that expanded and contracted according to natural rhythms rather than digital reminders. Time to taste food,